everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for one of our weekly Fortune 500 focused webinars here. My name is Sam, and I will be moderating throughout this presentation. In just a moment, we'll be joined by Patrick Ray, one of our senior financial advisors. Patrick is going to be covering the key considerations, such as financial implications and important strategies for finding purpose in retirement that aligns with your goals and aspirations. After his presentation, he will also be answering some of the questions we've encountered recently. I invite you to stick around if you're interested in listening for those. If you find you have a question throughout the presentation, I will be monitoring that question and answer box, so please feel free to ask away. It is 100% anonymous. You don't have to worry about that, and we do our best to answer and address as many questions as we can throughout the presentation. If we don't get to your question specifically in the presentation, we will make sure that we contact you and help you answer that question after the presentation on the phone. And after the presentation is ended, you will be redirected to our homepage where you can book an appointment with Patrick or one of his colleagues if you wish. Get your specific concerns addressed by them specifically. You can also take advantage of our complimentary cash flow analysis and many other resources that we have available for you. So please take advantage of those. And lastly, I should just remind you, we are not affiliated nor endorsed whatsoever by any specific company. We are a completely independent group of financial advisors here, so please keep that in mind as you are listening along today. And without further ado, let's get to the presentation with Patrick Ray.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today, and appreciate the introduction, Sam. Yeah, thanks for spending a few minutes with us. Excuse me. Today, we're going to talk about what I feel like is something that is a reoccurring theme, and it seems to be getting sooner and sooner and sooner in people's lives, which is the appropriate time not only to retire, but thinking and considering retiring earlier than you would have otherwise anticipated. I think it's fair to say, if we go back 15, 20, 25 years, most people would have assumed that the average age of retirement is closer to 65. And today, I think it's closer to 60. And many of our folks that we chat with are looking even to get away from work and venture off into the next phase of their lives, even into their early to mid 50s. And so we're going to talk about some of these things and some things to be mindful of for sure when you consider what is involved. And so most Americans who are between 55 and 59 are only a few years away from claiming Social Security. As many of you may know, you can claim Social Security on a reduced benefit as early as 62. But most of those people are still working. And so the ever-evolving challenge is to determine when might be the most appropriate time to mix retirement, especially if it's correlated to the need for you to take Social Security to help you offset what you remove from your investments and your otherwise saved capital that you've been working an entire lifetime to accumulate. And so deciding to retire early is a big deal, right? And generally, if you consider retiring before age 65, you're considering retiring early, if you will. And we've termed the phrase FIRE movement, if you will, with the ability to have financial independence and retire early, right? It's an acronym that unfortunately, in many cases, or most cases, requires a very aggressive savings model and a really detailed oriented plan that's consistent with what we know will be fruitful for you during your retirement years, right? And a lot of those things aren't correlated to how some of you live today. So, for example, keeping the expenses low, keeping the debts off the books to the greatest degree you can. And maybe that includes car payments and credit card debt and things like this. And maybe you just have a mortgage payment. Some of you are keen to paying off your mortgage before you decide to retire regardless. And whether some or any of these things apply to you, the reality is that keeping expenses low and staying out of debt is, as we know, a crucial aspect of maintaining financial independence and being able to retire early. And so from a personal goals perspective, aligning your personal goals with retirement is a big deal on two fronts, not just from a cash flow perspective, but what may be best for you to keep you mentally in check with retirement. Many of the people that I've spoke to in my 25-year career have often put off retirement because they're unsure what they're going to do when they stop working. And this is a very common thing. And we'll talk a little bit more this afternoon about how you could potentially address this particular issue. But the bottom line is this requires some significant sacrifices if you're considering retiring at an early pace or an early time frame in your lifetime, and you're going to need to find a fulfillment and an effective be content with some of these decisions that are required. Like maybe you don't eat out as much as you otherwise would have liked. Maybe you're forced to save more money to try to fill in the back end of your retirement because your need for income is higher than the average person, for example. And so there's a ton of challenges with respect to early retirement, and the feelings that are involved are often a secondary situation or circumstance that oversee the actual rules that you need to have in place to be comfortable when you decide to transition off the payroll, especially if you do it early. So having a plan that's in sync with not just your personal goals, but your partner as well. Often I meet with people and one spouse is ready to do one thing and another spouse is hesitant to do that because of this, that, or the other. And so it's crucial that both spouses obviously are involved in the decision-making process from start to finish so that everybody is on the same page. And I feel like if I go back and take a survey of the 400 plus folks that I've helped retire and transition into retirement over my 25-year career, that the one main component of all of the people who are married would argue that both spouses were involved from the start, the planning process, getting into retirement, transitioning into retirement, and then living the lives that they're comfortable living, for sure, is a key component. And so a detailed cash flow is probably the number one priority to make this happen. And if you haven't started this process, in my opinion, and the stance that we have as a firm, is this is mandatory. You just absolutely need to do a analysis to figure out how you're going to replace your current income. So if you're an individual that can't fathom living off of anything less than what you currently bring in every 2 weeks from your job, then you better figure out how to replenish that number if you decide to stop working, right? Because when you stop working, those paychecks stop coming in, and therefore you're going to be subject to whatever it is that you've accumulated during your life to live off of, and potentially Social Security at some point in time in the future as well. So understanding how to replace your income and the aspects of that are a key component of not just retiring early, but developing a cash flow analysis that will help you understand how to how to replace what it is that you've been using to live off of for the last 15, 20, 25, 30 plus years. Calculating your expenses is unbelievably important. And frankly, this is a step that no one basically ever does, right? This is probably a detailed, important part of the financial planning and retirement planning process that is easily overlooked because you'll just guesstimate how much you need for living expenses and how much you have to spend for entertainment and traveling and these kind of things. And so I think the more detail that you put into this particular scenario when you try to transition into retirement and start developing the cash flow needs that you're going to have when you actually transition into retirement is absolutely vital. And so the more detailed of an orientation you have on your expenses in retirement, probably the smoother your retirement is going to end up being. And so when we think about the sources of post-retirement income, you're going to talk about your savings accounts and your investment accounts that you've put inside your 401k, and some of you have pension plans, and maybe you inherited some money from your folks who suffered an untimely death. But it's going to be a combination of these things. And to add to that, I think that some of the most helpful steps are things that go overlooked because you're transitioning into retirement, leaving work, and you don't think to yourself, well, maybe I should get some part-time work. But as an example, let's say you're into golf and you want to play a lot of golf when you retire. That's one of your hobbies. You may consider working at the golf course 2 or 3 days a week on a part-time basis to get a reduction in your green fees, or maybe you can play for free, or you can hit balls for free, and things that could potentially add up over a longer window of time, as an example, to transition into part-time work. And so not necessarily thinking working is going to be a necessity because you're leaving a 40, 50, 60 hour a week job and you don't want to do that anymore. Well, and we can totally appreciate that. The part-time work is more correlated to keeping in check mentally and also bringing in some ancillary income that could potentially help with some of your smaller expenses during retirement. And so the key is to understand what it is that is necessary for you to draw from your savings and investments and all the capital that you have that you've worked to accumulate, and ensuring that that doesn't deplete, obviously, during your life expectancy. And so having a cash flow analysis that helps you kind of gravitate towards understanding the big picture and how inflation impacts that and how interest rates impact that and how rates of return on your investments impact that will all be a crucial point of the transition on the financial independence and retiring early process for sure. This is a part that is probably underestimated in a lot of cases, especially for our younger folks. So if you're thinking about retiring in your early to mid 50s or even in your late 50s, Medicare doesn't kick in until you're 65. And so even if you have retiree eligible medical from your job, these are additional expenses that could come up, right? And so what's beautiful about the planning process is you can incorporate an additional expense that maybe you otherwise didn't plan on having, so that you can see the stress test of what that means to you in years 5, 10, 15, and 20 years down the road. So, of course, healthcare planning in the early part of your retirement is not just important, it's vital. And if you have a 5 to 6, 7 year gap between the time you retire and 65 before Medicare kicks in, it's mandatory that you do this, thinking about emergency funds and how to cover short-term expenses and things that come up that you obviously didn't plan for. This is all part of the planning process and something that we feel strongly that you should give some consideration to for sure. This part of the budget with respect to how much you're actually spending is the part that I spoke about just a few minutes ago that often is overlooked, which is going through the process of listing all of what you're going to anticipate from an income perspective and where the money is going to come from, as well as what you spend on a monthly basis. And this suggests that, doing it for a 2 to 3 month window is a smart idea. I would argue that you need to do this for at least 6 months, maybe even closer to a year. And I'll give you an example about something that could easily be overlooked is, let's say you have a mortgage-free home. If you do, good for you. But as you know, there are expenses that are associated with even a mortgage-free home that consists of taxes and insurance, right? And maybe you pay your taxes and insurance on an annual basis. And let's say that bill comes due in the middle of the year in July. And you're doing a budget and you're anticipating what your expenditures are between February and April, as an example. Well, you forgot that it costs you, $3,200 for insurance and taxes that you need to account for, which is effectively close to $300 a month that needs to be included in the budget, as an example. So it's better to do it over a longer window of time. And if you can stomach the frustration, if you will, if you're not accustomed to living off of a budget, you should do that probably over a 12-month window to give you a better understanding of what that retirement budget needs to look like. And so, of course, from an early perspective, it helps with the shortfalls and potential shortfalls and gives you a chance to adjust accordingly. So if you wait to do all this when you're 55, and for example, you're planning on retiring at 57, you got a really short window of time to make an adjustment to fix this, right? But if you put some time and effort into this when you're 50 and you're considering retiring at 55 or 56 or 57, as an example, you've got a 5-year window to make some corrections to sew up some shortfalls that you otherwise thought that maybe were taken care of, but because of the effort that you put into the planning process and in the budget, it helps you understand that you need to do a little bit more. And so maybe you got to cut out a few of those meals that you're spending on an out basis from while you're working and put that into your 401k, right? Or help offset that with some additional aggressive ways to get rid of some debt so that you don't have that expense leading into retirement. And so those are all some of the examples that have to do with early retirement, of course. And then from a financial planning perspective, and as for sure coming where we come from an advisory perspective, is to put some insights and concerns that maybe you haven't considered, right? So for example, if you're retiring in your early to mid 50s, you want to consider what the taxation issues that you could potentially have because you're not 59 and a half. And so some of you may be scratching your head and say, well, I don't know what that means. Well, there's a lot to it, right? And there's a part of the IRS codes that apply to how to get access to your 401ks that apply to a certain group of people, and then how to apply a withdrawal rate that's comfortable for you to live off of on your IRAs if you have IRAs. And even though you're not 59 and a half, get away from paying the 10% penalty as one simple example. So this also helps us create a sustainable plan, right? Let's face it. Most of you don't want to transition into retirement and then be glued to CNBC or try to pay attention to what's happening in the economic conditions and the interest rate environment and what's happening in the world to figure out how that applies to what you should be doing from a strategy perspective to manage your lifetime savings. And so, of course, we make a living on helping people transition into retirement and enjoying their retirement, and not necessarily having a concern as to what their investments and their plan is doing on a given daily or weekly or monthly basis. And so some things to watch out for as a pitfall. Experience tells us that the healthcare thing that I talked to a few minutes about just a few minutes ago is a big one, especially if you're going to retire and you're not yet 65. And then overestimating the income that's going to come from your investment. So, for example, oftentimes I feel like there are people who consider that they can remove 6, 7, 8, maybe even 9% from their investment portfolio, but they have a 50-50 mix of stocks and bonds because that's all that they can stomach from a risk perspective. Well, these two things aren't correlated, right? So in other words, it's going to be tough for someone to continue to stay on the trend, the path of trajectory that they wish to stay on, and having a risk tolerance that is not consistent with what you need to remove from your assets to be able to live the lifestyle that you wish to live. So I'd be very careful about that. And this is part of the process of doing some planning so that you don't assume the incorrect information from what you've worked an entire lifetime to accumulate. Well, by the way, there's a personal aspect to retirement, right? With respect to identifying hobbies and passions. And I mentioned earlier, I've had people who don't retire because they don't have any hobbies and they don't necessarily they're not passionate about any given activity or anything, traveling or anything. Maybe they don't have kids or grandkids, and it just keeps them in check with being able to mentally stay in tune. And so they still work and they keep working. And even though they potentially even could afford to retire, they do that because they don't have any hobbies or any passions. So this might give you an opportunity to consider some things that you otherwise wanted to do, but maybe didn't uh, check into or look into or even experiment with in your previous years, obviously when you were still working, right? So retirement is a perfect time to experiment with new hobbies and engaging in just regular activities that maybe you didn't give some consideration for, right? So it provides you a sense of being in tune with what's happening, right? Not mentally checking out and saying, oh, I'm just going to transition from work and I'm going to sit on my couch and wilt away over the next 10 years and that's going to be it. So we want to make sure you have a well-rounded and satisfying life, and that has a lot to do with considering what things that might be important to you when you actually transition into retirement. And so the importance of personal goals obviously are to explore that are not tied to a work balance, and so that's important too, right? So some of the things that you are accustomed to doing was work related, and so we want to make sure that if you consider some of these things that they're personal related and they don't have anything to do with work. And so you may consider new skills, learning a new language, joining a class to learn about history or some travel adventures, doing some fitness related things. I know pickleball is a thing, so I have a lot of clients that are spending a lot of times 2-3 days a week playing pickleball to enjoy themselves. And so passionate things that you can engage and maybe even keep a social aspect to this will obviously benefit you in the grand scheme of things. And so the bottom line is to ensure that you have a plan, right? We know that statistically 74% of people over the age of 50 do not have a written financial plan. And that is ridiculous, mostly because there are firms like ours that do this as a way to introduce their services to you, and they don't even charge you for that. So when we do a financial analysis for somebody, we're trying to learn what your goals and aspirations are and what you're trying to accomplish when you transition into retirement. And you might walk away with that and decide that we're not the fit for you, and that may very well happen. But the fact is that if you don't do any planning, you're going to potentially be off and not have the ability to have a sustainable trajectory when you look and proceed into retirement. So that's why we think that establishing a cash flow analysis is important. And specifically from the retirement group's perspective, is we got a lot of experience doing it, and we have a lot of experience not just with the retirement planning process as a whole, but with corporate employees, with a lot of companies that you probably are familiar with and you have worked with, and we have offices across the country and specific knowledge to these plans that are relevant to your savings and your pension plans and medical plans and things like this. And oh, by the way, we're one of those firms that I mentioned to you that offer a complimentary cash flow analysis. So if you're so inclined, feel free to reach out to us in a number of ways you can do that. email us at info@theretirementgroup.com. You can reach out to our 800 number, which is 800-900-5867. You can take a picture or schedule a meeting by using this QR code to the left, which will give you access to a calendar, and you can pick a convenient time to spend a few minutes with either myself or one of my coworkers here at the firm, and we'd be glad to help you. And then if you're not already doing so, please follow us on LinkedIn. We've got some company specific stuff at LinkedIn that provides a ton of value that you might be interested in. And if you're not already doing so, I encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn. And so so that brings us to a close for what we had to talk about today. So I appreciate you sharing some time with us this afternoon. The reality is planning is the number one priority in most every aspect of what I talked about this afternoon. And so you don't know what you don't know, right? So getting the ball started and processing the plan to the best degree you can with some help from maybe someone in our shoes would be the best and most appropriate step that we can advise you to take to be comfortable when you decide to transition into retirement. So having said that, I'm going to give the presentation back to Sam to make sure we don't have any questions before we let you go for the afternoon. Sam?
Thank you, Patrick. I apologize if you guys hear airplanes. We are very near Miramar Air Force Base, so they seem to be practicing or something right now. So sorry if you can hear that. Alrighty, Patrick, we're going to answer this first question. If I retire early, will my healthcare costs go up?
Well, that sounds like maybe a company specific question, but in general, I think you can expect to spend more if you retire early, right? So I talked about the importance of doing some planning, and the key component is the healthcare aspect of retiring in your early to mid 50s, as an example. So I guess the answer to the question technically is yes, because you can expect to spend more. Because by definition, someone who retires at 55, for example, has a 10-year window before Medicare is going to kick in. That could potentially have some ancillary benefits because maybe your employer gives you some supplement to your Medicare supplement plans that you otherwise would have had to pay for. So the answer is yes, you can expect to probably spend more money. And the beauty of doing an analysis is we can segregate some additional expenses over and above what you're currently used to or accustomed to spending. So for example, let's say you're spending $1,000 a month for healthcare premiums for you and your spouse, okay? We put that in the budget, but then we also advocate that you have a different line item for additional potential expenses that you're unexpected. So for example, we can incorporate another $1,000 a month because there's added expenses that you didn't know you were going to have before you reach 65 from a medical perspective. And so we can stress test that both with and without in retirement, so you can see what that does to the impact of your overall assets 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. So I think the most and safest thing to tell you is yes, you can expect those expenses to be higher if you decide to retire early.
All right, thank you. And we're gonna just answer one more because we're running out of time, but I wanted to quickly remind you all that after this presentation is ended, you will be redirected to our homepage where you can book an appointment with Patrick or one of his colleagues if you wish, and also take advantage of several other resources we have available, such as the cash flow analysis, which is a complimentary service that Patrick mentioned before. Okay, Patrick, last question. A recent article I read mentioned using the pension to buy an annuity rather than taking an annuity from my company. Does this make sense if my pension is over $1 million?
What a great question. The answer to this 4 years ago was no way. You should take the company annuity and ride off into the sunset. And the reason I say that is because of what the interest rates have basically done over the last 3 to 4 years, right? Since COVID, the trajectory of inflation, which also ties to interest rates, is doing nothing but this, right? And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because it gives people a chance to potentially consider something that they didn't otherwise consider, which is taking the lump sum and purchasing their own annuity. And so you may consider that for a myriad of reasons, one of which may be that if you get the company annuity and then your company sells off the liability to another carrier, it's going to go to an annuity carrier to begin with. And so in most cases anyway. So I think it's safe to say that because of where the interest rates are and the possibility that you could not only regurgitate the check that they would have otherwise given you, but you can also, dependent on the type of annuity that you purchase, keep the money in the family in case you and your spouse suffer an untimely death. And so if you're open or interested into that, please reach out to us because we've got some solutions for you for sure. But the short answer to your question is yes, you should absolutely consider it. And it just gives you some additional information to concern yourself with, right? To consider all aspects of what's best, whether they're considered beneficial to you or not. And then that way you've got a full plate of options for you, and you can be at peace with knowing that whatever it is that you decide to do, that it's consistent with your long-term goals and retirement objectives, and you should be in good shape.
Definitely. There's a lot to think about. Alrighty, Patrick, that was all we had time for today. Thank you so much, Patrick, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We hope that you got your questions answered and that you learned something today, and you'll make an appointment with Patrick or someone here at the retirement group very soon. Thank you all. Have a great day. Thanks,
Have a
Patrick.
great day. Take care. Thank you.